So I'd like to start by saying, Jack, I'm a consultant and I agree with you. We are great at analyzing data. We're really not good at plotting the future forward. And in fact, there are plenty of examples of fellow firms of mine that have made some recommendations that are real doozies. And if you're unlucky enough, eventually you get to see them make some kind of a massive acquisition to make up for the loss that you said, and you realize just how much you cost them and hope that your other work is beneficial. I've also got a bit of good news and bad news for you. The good news is you're only a half hour away from a well-deserved glass of wine. The bad news is you actually have to listen to me for a half hour to get there. So I thank you all for the time. I'm Matthew Collier, and I'm the global head of healthcare strategic consulting at Accenture. But I've spent 25 years in health, and one of the nice things about having spent that much time is that you are able to darken just about every corner of an industry and play a bunch of different roles. So I've been CEO, I've been board member, I've been advisor. And I'll tell you, one of the great lessons that was provided me by one of my board members in my first company, a gentleman by the name of Bob Mumson, really one of the legends of the venture world. He said, look, Matthew, as the CEO of this startup, your job is to be a paid zealot. And he said, my job is to be a bit skeptical. And so I know in this room we've got some zealots and we've got skeptics, and I'm going to try and navigate between the two and hopefully poke and prod each one of you and see if we can't generate some angst and some good dialogue that'll spill over into the wine. I would say that I'm going to really emphasize 5 different points today that I hope you come away with. The first is that adoption in healthcare is slow. It's slow and it's unevenly distributed, and therefore one needs to be very practical, very selective in how you view a go-to-market strategy, and consider reach-around strategies that reach around the existing incumbents in the healthcare system. Number 2, I would say that we have an outcomes problem. I can't tell you how many different companies I've seen and run that promise to improve outcomes. If it was disease management in the early 90s, remote patient monitoring in the early 2000s, digital health of today, every one of them promises outcomes improvement. They're very elusive and hard to come by, so make sure that any investment that you do doesn't rest on those outcomes in order to succeed. There has to be another profitable way and reason to do it. I'll get into a little more of how that plays out in a second. Third is that the era of convergence and co-opetition is here. If you look at some of the most exciting business models, they are bringing together multiple entities from multiple aspects, not only within the different silos of healthcare, but also reaching far out of healthcare. You know, I think here of Samsung, which is in partnership with Accenture and Kaiser Permanente to do cardiac medical management and take it to the next level. Right? That's a very unholy trio, but we're actually all working together and doing some really amazing things. I would also say that you need to, when I look at the market anyway, one man's opinion, there's actually a lot of reason to believe we may be at the inflection point of change here. There's a lot of reason to be pretty optimistic when you look at some of the advancements of technology, you look at regulation freeing up, you look at reimbursement becoming more copacetic with new innovation. There's a lot of reason to believe that we might actually be able to get there. And if you, let's actually, I don't even have that. There you go. That'd be helpful. So we have 2 different worlds that we're living within. On the one hand, we have massive potential opportunity. This is an enormous industry, 18.5% of the US GDP, and it's enormously poorly run. That creates an opportunity for financial efficiency that's pretty unparalleled in industries. And there is a reason, therefore, that just about every sector you know of is looking to find a way into health. And I'd hearken back to, I think, some famous bank robber in the 20s, and they asked him, why do you rob banks? And he said, well, because that's where the money is. It's the same thing here. It's why Google invested $3.5 billion in medical startups in the digital health arena in the last 3 years. It's why Comcast is developing a medical strategy. It's why I was talking to a company that's Paris-based. They make the majority of dashboards and dashboard systems for cars across all manufacturers. Do you know what they want to talk about? As you look into the future, not so far off, I've got a Tesla, so I can see it happening pretty soon. of self-driving cars, we're going to have a lot of time on our hands when we don't really have to do anything. Wouldn't that be an interesting venue for clinical engagement, assessment, management, improvement? So they wanted here's a dashboard company that wants a healthcare strategy, right? So everybody is piling on here. But the other world here is that it's actually reality is a little bit slower. The returns really have not lived up to the aspirations we would have. The level of actual mobilization in the market, not as much as the really potential would lead you to think could happen. And so why is that? And I think back here, so at UPMC, I don't know if the gentleman who spoke from there is still here, but I have to give hats off to you. You're one of maybe a half a dozen health institutions in the country that are operating in that manner. Banner joins you along with a few others. But there was a fantastic panel of 4 CEOs of academic medical centers last year at the Health Evolution CEO Summit. The moderator was a innovative, digitally disrupting technology CEO. And he asked the question, he said, tell me, and by extension, all the other digitally innovative folks here in the room, how can we not have the exciting technologies we develop crash up against the shore of the bulwarks of your organization? What's the route in? What was fascinating to me was that of the 4, one, the CEO was really unique, very similar to UPMC, and he said, look, I've reduced my direct reports to 4. One of them is a chief innovation officer, and I've enabled him to really drive innovation into the organization. So that's who you go to, that's who helps plot the track forward. The other 3 CEOs, and this mirrors the vast majority that I see and visit in my work around the country, no idea. They couldn't tell you how you could bring a new technology to fruition in their own health systems. So when you look at this and realize no matter how good and exciting you are, the majority of the health market just isn't interested in adopting. That's a really interesting challenge, right? And it means that you have to be very selective. And here I think of something that's a little more optimistic. Working with the CEO of one of the largest health systems in the country, more than 140 hospitals. And we had a discussion recently where we're really realizing they can be a kingmaker. With over 140 hospitals, if they put their weight behind a new technology, startup, or capability, they're an actor on the stage. They're not just waiting for the future and going to participate in it. They can actually create it. They can be a kingmaker of digital health, select and define who will succeed because that's who gets that level of investment. Kaiser Permanente views the world in a very similar manner, except they love to, once they play with your technology for a while, co-opt it and develop it on their own, so they're a little more challenging to deal with. But what that all means when you bring it together is that when you think about the opportunities for your companies and trying to steer them as to where they should find market opportunity, on the one hand, they should be open to reach around strategies, to going directly to consumers. We'll talk about a lot of the engagement companies have done. On the other hand, be very selective in the first landing points you think of as customers who are actually partners, not just customers. That said, the investment has been fantastic. There's a lot of different cuts at this data. You can find some that are projections that are higher or lower, but they all agree on the fact that this has consistently grown at a CAGR close to 25% a year. What's more interesting about digital health, I think, is look at the bottom number, and that is the average deal size. What we are seeing is a maturation of this industry on a bit of hyper speed. This is only 7 years, right? And we've seen a dramatic lift in the scale. And what's happening now is the investment dollars, for the most part, are going into scaling go-to-market activities, not development activities. That's one of the reasons on the inflection point, I think we might be near a tipping point, because we are seeing a maturation and a deployment now of these technologies. What are the winners? What are the losers? The reality, first of all, is they're all winners. So it's relative growth is what you see from the 2 on the top versus the 2 on the bottom. Digital health really got its start with the consumer engagement. That's the sexy piece, the MD Alives of the world, the Simplies of the world in billing. That was what everybody got excited about, is how do I engage a consumer in a new way with a digitally enabled, efficient communication vehicle. That's still very much deployed in the market. And I've got to, how many of you are doctors, by the way? Okay, and I notice my girlfriend is a doctor as well, which make this comment very challenging. You are all I will say, involved in an unrequited love affair. Every one of you. Yes, if your patient is a aged, chronic, multi-comorbid patient, the laying of the hands, as someone said earlier today, the relationship with that patient is critical. For the vast majority of the other patients, they don't want a relationship with you. You want it with them. They don't want it with you. They want convenience, ease of use, access. I was sick the other day. I went on MD Alive in 5 minutes. I had a face-to-face with a doctor. I had a prescription waiting for me at the pharmacy. Done. It took me less time to get that whole process done than it would have taken me to drive to my doctor's office. And by the way, I don't have a doctor. So the answer when patients come in and you say, who's your primary care physician? The answer now ever more frequently is, I don't have one. And so recognize we are entering that new world where we're already there, where patient engagement is divorced from the traditional Marcus Welby MD, and I know I'm aging myself a bit with that reference, into a much more fluid, engaged mode that actually has a lot more in common with how you engage with Amazon or Google than it does with how you engaged with your healthcare of decades past. Where the money has really been made, however, has been in infrastructure. It's really sexy things like AI bots replacing call center agents or AI bots in the revenue cycle of a hospital. That's where most of the money has been deployed in actual market uptake. And we actually passed a pretty interesting inflection point on the AI side this year in call centers. A little story that popped up 3 months ago. Not many people, I imagine, have heard it. We all know that having an AI bot be your call center agent is cheaper than having an individual do it. That's why they deploy it. 3 months ago, they did a big study, and the most advanced systems are better than the human agents at generating customer satisfaction in those who call in. So they're now not only cheaper, they're better. So that's a big step forward. Diagnosis and treatment is an interesting one. That was where all the hype started out. Right? If you think about the majority of articles that have been written about digital health, it's all about diagnosis and treatment. Tough nut to crack, and the investment has only recently really begun to take off in that realm. And here's where I would say, as we think about the investment taking off in that area, and as you see, as I'm sure all of you will, or if you haven't already, companies that come to you for funding that seek to address that, I get back to my point about outcomes, and outcomes being challenging, right? That when you look back at these disease management companies of the 90s that became the remote patient monitoring companies of the 2000s, they all had adoption to some degree or another by payers. Every payer offers a bunch of these disease management programs. Do you know that none of them deliver any clinical outcome benefit? Unless the one exception being cardiac post-acute recidivism. That one example is an exception. The rest, they don't generate any outcomes benefit. Why do the payers then fund them? The payers fund them because it's a marketing tool. They can tell the employer they've got these great programs. They can help to get your loyalty because they say, look, we've got this great program just for you, and it allows me to engage with you in a way that's more intense than my natural business model would be. Recognize that a payer typically only engages with you when they send you a bill. Not a very winning loyalty driver. Well, if they've got you signed up for a disease management program, that can generate loyalty. You'll feel stickiness. That's why that stuff exists. And I think here as a great example of this was a study that I think of as, frankly, it's the best study I've ever read. And I can say this because though Accenture did it, they did it before I joined them. I've only been at Accenture for a few years. They did a cohort study of 2 hospitals in Basque Spain, Basque and La Fay. And for these 2 hospitals, they split their chronically ill patients into 2 cohorts. One managed the old way, the other managed with a cloud-based layer and predictive analytics algorithms that Accenture provided, and most importantly, a model of engagement that took the clinicians and the nurses and pushed them outside of the 4 walls of the hospital and into the community to engage with patients at home. What they found is that, first of all, patient satisfaction rates were through the roof. They spent so much less time in hospitals. And for many of them that were heading to end of life, that's a much more elegant way to meet that part of your life. Secondly, was just in the 2 years of the trial, just in the 2 hospitals, just in that half a cohort that they actually did this with, they saved $200 million. That's real money when you're talking about a hospital, and these are not huge numbers of patients. So massive improvement in the quality of life, dramatic improvement in cost reduction. There was no clinical difference between the two. And so here's why, when my skepticism about the outcomes, well earned over the many years of having been told by company after company they've generated and then seeing them not do so, doesn't mean these business models can't float. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do them. Right? There's a lot of other benefits, and I do, by the way, I am a bit of a zealot. I believe we will conquer this at some point. And the first steps that get us there are these steps that are paid for by cost reduction, paid for by loyalty. I'll tell you right now, hospitals were talking all the rage about population health over the course of the last 5 years. In the last 2 years, not many of my clients are talking about it anymore. This whole pivot to fee for value, we're still 85% fee for service. And with our latest election results, the expected fairly rapid change to fee for value is now delayed for at least 3, maybe 7 years. So there is a pause and a breathtaking in the population health investment. But many of the same things you would do to drive a population health program are great customer loyalty programs. So we're doing a lot of work in digital customer engagement, which is laying the groundwork and is the first stepping stones on the way to pop health. But it's being paid for by customer loyalty. And I think here of Providence, for example. They've got a group called Express Care that they frame as the front end, the atrium to their hospital systems. And it involves actually, many of you may have heard of Walgreens' kind of on-again, off-again love affair with Minute Clinics. CVS is going whole hog towards it. Walgreens moved far into it. Couldn't get comfortable with the indirect cost benefit of the ancillary buy of the candy bar in and out as you got to the clinic, and then pulled back. That left a lot of open slots. Providence and some other payers around the country are stepping in and setting up clinics that are run and paid for by the hospital in clinics that are, in Walgreens, that happen to be positioned in catchment areas for their referral base. They pair that with nurse at-home visits, telepresence with clinicians, cloud-based continuity of data between patient, clinic, nurse, doctor, acute care, where they've put it in. And this whole program, by the way, assessed on its own merit, loses money, just like Minute Clinics do. But it drives 15% growth, incremental growth, in the hospitals in which it's put in place around. So again, being creative about where does the revenue come from, how does my business model stick, this is critical to success in the digital health world these days. There's also a massive shift in the profit pools. This was the 5th out of 5 points that I failed to make at the beginning of the talk. And it's shifting from sensing, where so much money has been made, from the pacemakers, which for the last 10 years have been completely generic. There is no meaningful difference between pacemakers. 75% of them are never turned off their base factory settings. Yet they defy gravity in pricing because of the structure of the industry. That's finally beginning to change. I don't know if many of you may know or may not know, Medtronic runs about 82, 84% margin on pacemakers. So there is a lot of money to be taken out of that system, and the only thing preventing it is a little bit of a restructuring of the incentives of the health system. And what we're seeing, therefore, is across the span in sensing devices, there's ASP compression undergoing right now. We're already seeing it, and it's going to accelerate. On the aggregate and analyze, it's interesting, because a lot of people, I can't tell you how many clients have wanted to pay me good money to figure out how they could sell their data. And after the first couple, I had to just tell everyone, look, let me tell you, first of all, your data isn't worth anything in and of its own. And this is health systems, this is drug distributors, specialty pharma. Everyone thinks they've got unique, great data that would, damn, people really want to buy it. Reality is the data is never worth anything on its own. What it is, where it becomes valuable is when it fuels a business model that relies on the data for a differentiated offering, but is a more solution-oriented approach. And that's where the serving is coming in. And that's where the profit pool is really jumping to now. We also did a survey over the last 18 months of 52 CEOs of major health systems and 35 CEOs of major payers. And when I say survey, I mean we sat down and had an hour-long interview with them. And some fascinating key messages came out. First is, we all know that cost is an issue in health, but there's been an on-again, off-again love affair with actually doing anything about it. I would say now for providers in many markets, not all to be sure, but in many markets, it's very much on. In fact, I was talking to one CEO about 6 months ago, and he said, Matthew, I've gone from being concerned about my health system's cost to being terrified. Because in many markets, they're going to be dipping down to a lack of profitability. There's a certain Northwest health system, they need to save $2.5 billion off of their annual line over the next 5 years. That's enormous, right? So cost is becoming real. On the other end of the spectrum, just to be balanced, Jack referenced Stanford. I happen to love Stanford as well. I've went there as a student and they backed some of my companies. Stanford Hospital is the most expensive hospital in the country. New CEO and COO came in there, David Entwistle and Quinn from University of Utah, and they said, this is nuts. We have to take this down. And they had 1 quarter with negative financial returns, and they were saying, never let a good crisis go unused. So they started trotting that out and beating the drum of cost reduction, and with a health system, you need to mobilize a lot of people to get their agreement to act. And then, darn if they didn't return to profitability in a big way the next quarter and the quarter after. And so now that the steam has come out of that engine. But it's very indicative, right, of health, where you've got certain areas, certain markets, Southern California, Pacific Northwest, Minneapolis, where the pressures, the dynamic competitive pressures are driving this evolution of the health change. And then others, like Stanford, pretty unique, where they're pretty much insulated for a while. They can be the most expensive and still make a lot of money. Skepticism across the ecosystem. One of the things I would say you definitely run into is if you want to predict when a health system is going to switch over and get more aggressive about adopting new digital technologies, it's when they get a new CEO. Most of the CEOs I deal with, frankly, and they're my clients, so I should be kinder, but frankly, they are hoping they can retire before they have to make these changes. Because these changes are hard. They're really difficult. They outstretch the executives' understanding and ability to figure it out. They outstretch their organization's ability to fund the pass through the J-curve. And so there is a great deal of just hoping I can just push it off long enough to reach my golden years. The other is this cross-boundary collaboration, which is becoming absolutely endemic, and co-opetition becoming endemic. You're seeing partnerships arise between consumer technology, retail, health, life sciences, just a vast array. The technological catch-up is a big issue. Again, this industry is one that is pretty, how should we say it, retarded relative to every other industry in terms of its adoption of technologies. And so there's a lot of need for them to build infrastructure in order to actually do the same kinds of things that like your bank does when they try to engage with you. But there are 3 points that are really, in addition to the loosening regulation environment, in addition to the more positive reimbursement environment, there are 3 massive technological developments that are going to fuel a significant launch pad for this sector. First is AI. Now, we recognize, as we all do, AI doesn't exist yet. What we're talking about here is big data, deep analytics, statistical algorithms, but they're still really powerful and can do some amazing things. And what you're seeing is massive in-process cost reduction, displacement of workers, yes. It's aiding and abetting the digital solutions from a variety of other angles. I remember at the same Health Evolution Summit, it seemed like every other CEO I met was like, oh, we've got an AI engine at the heart of our offering. It is absolutely fueling ubiquitously, and it plays right into the data explosion. And someone referenced that earlier today. He was saying 10 to the 18th gigabytes of data. We're actually heading to 10 to the 24th in a year. So there's this massive logarithmic growth in the amount of data. And more importantly now is not just the amount of data, but we have major, big names, big dollars, Predix at GE, Google, Philips, that are investing to create, and have now created, platforms for digesting that data, assessing it, and deriving insights and implications from it. So that's going to be a big change to how we do business. And then finally, this point about the proven outcomes through collaboration that I've made several times. And one great example there is Boston Scientific, that is working with us, Accenture, and this goes back to the shifting profit pools from sense to serve. They see this coming down the pike, and what they've done is they are partnering with providers using a cloud-based analytics layer that we provide to manage the outcomes post-acute surgery. And they go at risk to those outcomes. Now, again, so that we're all a little bit emboldened on one side, but cautioned on the other, their first launch is Norway, their next market is the UK. They're going to come to the US at some point, even though they're a US domiciled country. They're going to come here when we're ready. And with 85% of our market fee for service, we're not yet ready for it. But these three advancements amongst the basic structural components of the industry that are changing set the stage, I think, for some really interesting adoption. And so I therefore leave you with a thought. Roy Amara, a researcher born in 1925, made a wonderful statement that was then repeated by Bill Gates not that long ago. And it is part of the human condition that we always overestimate the impact of disruptive change over the near term, and we underestimate it over the long term. That has tremendous implications for investors. And if there was one thing I was trying to communicate in my talk today, it was that, right? And it stitches together the fact that adoption is slow. It's challenging. It's unevenly distributed. You need to be really smart at how you play that game. Outcomes, difficult to get. Find other reasons to make money on the path to those outcomes. Now I'm 2 out of 5 and I've already hit my senility point and can't go any further. So the other three that I mentioned, they're there too. And with that, I'll let you ask any questions you have and get a drink.
Mr. Matthew.
I apologize for asking this question, but it's curious. So I was not here from yesterday and this morning, but throughout this afternoon, despite their interest in healthcare, I've not heard anyone mention IBM. Why is, and obviously you're a competitor, but
yes.
I mean, why is that? I mean,
So the angle is
here.
Yeah, the angle is IBM Watson is the most hyped AI platform that you can think of. And they have gone out very broadly and partnered with J&J. They've partnered with Medtronic. They've partnered with a whole variety of organizations. But when you actually peel the onion on that and see where are they actually being used, they massively mispriced their system, massively, order of magnitude, such that the economic models never pay out to use their system. The benefit you get from it just doesn't warrant the price you have to pay them for it. So actual adoption and utilization of Watson far, far less than the hype. And they're actually getting very frustrated with it internally.
Wouldn't it be fair to say, however, your comment might be slightly biased?
Yes, Accenture's making massive investments in AI as well, and priced at a very different point. But I would challenge you to do a little Googling, and you can, I think, arrive at the same point. Yes.
Matthew, Yuli Cherepali, I'm a researcher and a physician. You talk about AI, and we have seen the Gartner cycle where AI is at the top.
Yeah.
For the audience here who are angel investors, is there still opportunities to invest in AI-based applications?
Oh, I would say not only opportunities, but you can't avoid it. AI is becoming pretty ubiquitous in powering various solutions. But recognize you're not investing in the AI itself. You're investing in the solution enabled by it. It's a bit the same argument with the data. And AI is becoming, as it is right now, this deep analytics statistical algorithm program, it's becoming a little bit generic in and of itself. And there's so many different sources from where you can partner to get access to it.
Any other questions for Matthew?
Yes, Dan.
Hi, Dan. You talked about how you think we're at a tipping point, or perhaps at a tipping point, and you shared some statistics that gave you reason to believe that. Can you elaborate on that?
Certainly. So again, I don't think we're at a tipping point as far as it hospital adoption of new technologies. As for all the reasons I mentioned, they're still going to be slow, and there are many markets, Georgia for one, there are many others I could mention, where there's just no market incentive or motivation for them to adopt something new. Why tackle the hard problems? But I do see certain markets that are, so point one, there are certain markets that are pushing forward. And you get groups like Banner Health, under the guidance of the CEO, Peter Fine, who's a real piece of work, by the way, more skeptical of consultants than you, Jack. My colleagues visited him, he folded up their business cards into airplanes and threw it into the trash can. He is a force of nature, and he's driving innovation into his clinician groups to the point where they're spread across 8 different states now, and they are crushing it in those states. Stealing volume, operating at a lower price point, making more money, outgrowing the market. As a perfect example of that, he wanted his doctors to adopt telepresence. And with no offense to any of the doctors in the room, doctors don't tend to be on the leading edge of adopting some of these technologies. There was great concern about, can I get paid for it? Will I get sued? Do I get enough? What about the laying on of hands? And he said, nice, I appreciate all that, but you're going to do it. And so they did an experiment in Phoenix, 1 year, gave out iPads to every one of their chronically ill patients. On it were the usual edutainment type of assets, but also a single button push to an immediate telepresence with a Banner doc. What was fascinating at the end of that year was not only were their hospital visits down, and therefore economically they worked out quite a bit, their doctors were really excited. The doctors loved it. They said, I finally have a way to engage with my patient in a way that's really meaningful, where I can make a change because I feel like I'm in their home. So there are systems and markets that are adopting. That's one reason for optimism. The other reason is just a lot of these innovative companies, and this particularly as you see them scaling in the data I showed earlier, they're doing reach-around strategies. They're saying, I'm not waiting for Banner Health or Ascension or Providence or St. Joe's. I'm not waiting for any of these to adopt my system. I'm going to go straight to the consumer. I'm going to come at it with an entirely different angle. Right? I'm going to be Comcast, and I'm going to do a health strategy that brings me into your home as the pipe for healthcare management in the home. And that's where you're starting to see the scale really build. Plus now you have this new pivot towards treatment that already the early data on that is pretty promising. So I think that we're heading to a place where, remember that digital evolution of industries accelerates massively, unlike any other industry change we've seen before. And so when I look at the difference in change over the last 3 years, right? I've been working in this industry for 25 years. And it's an industry that 4 years ago I would have said, hasn't changed much since the days we exchanged chickens for care. Well, in the last 3 years, I've seen massive change, and that's just going to accelerate. So I do feel like we're at a tipping point. I recognize a lot of people have predicted the tipping point, and everyone's been wrong thus far. So going out on a ledge.
One more.
Yeah, John?
You talked about the consumer side of the whole picture as being maybe one of the forces of the future. Mm-hmm. At least I think that's where you're going. I'd really just like you to elaborate on that. I know you mentioned convenience rather than engagement as being the real value there. Mm-hmm. But could you go on? Is the consumer movement in healthcare at odds or at conflict with the movement that we've had so far, in which healthcare centers themselves have been growing and developing?
Interesting question, and I would say that I'd start with there we go, with a few different angles to address that. First is that this point of the unrequited love and the desire for efficiency. You don't have to go that far back in rewinding the tape to remember a time when a patient who visited you as a doctor or interacted with you as a payer or a hospital was comparing that interaction with the last time they went to a doctor, hospital, or payer. That's not true anymore. When consumers engage with a hospital or patient or doctor now, they're comparing it with the totality of other retail experiences in their world. And they are finding it is jarring to engage with health. And so you see business models like Simply, which is a rev cycle model, right? It handles the billing of an increasing number of health systems in the country, but it is fundamentally a consumer engagement, loyalty, interaction model. They just happen to apply it to billing because that's the primary mode of communication. And patients love it. And so I do think that there is the patient demand ultimately is trumping the reticence of the health system at large, particularly enabled by the fact that patients now are taking on an ever larger portion of their health bill. So when they start investing in their own money, very different things happen. I mean, we all know, I think we saw the increase from the pharma presentation. Health expense in the country is going up about 6% a year now, right? 6 to 8%, depending on the year. If you look at cosmesis, this is breast implants, calf implants, whatever floats your boat in that arena, guess what the cost increase per year is in that industry? Unreimbursed consumer elective. -5%. It follows a normal learning curve that other industries follow. Health is locked up because of the fractured nature of our health system to fight that. So consumers, as they become more empowered, as they become more exposed to the financial center, and as they are already steering towards new solutions, like my visit to MD Alive, we are making it happen as consumers, despite and over the objections of the hospitals and doctors that are there to serve us. Well, at the moment, not as much. I wouldn't say that's hurting them as much. And in fact, one of the interesting dynamics of this digital explosion is you probably have all heard the data. It's been widely distributed of projections of a massive doctor shortage over the course of the next 10 to 20 years. And that's a health crisis for America, and med schools are called to arms to teach more doctors. Well, actually, we just published a piece where we really looked at it as, because all those data were actually based on an assumption that the core nature of the work is unchanged. We looked at what is the work going to be like of a doctor 5, 10 years from now, based on new digital options. And actually, we're going to be fine. We're going to have plenty of doctors for the needs we have. And so there's a benefit to this care situation as well.
One more question here. I think another big role or thing that you may not have mentioned, or you kind of mentioned recently, but price transparency, I think, is going to play a huge role in regards to patient convenience and where healthcare is going to go in the future. I think that you're seeing it right now in the movement towards ASCs. There's even ASCs now that are publishing prices. Oklahoma City's doing it. I think there's a hospital in Denver now that's being very public about their pricing. That goes back to the consumerism you mentioned and the education of the patient. I mean, what are your thoughts in regards to that? And are a lot of companies tapping into that whole price transparency marketplace from a healthcare perspective?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I would say it's oddly, I think that the race towards full price transparency and the benefits that can come from that it's going to be lost to a more interactive model with patients where it's less relevant. And let me rewind and say why I say that. I remember when Gio Colella spun out of, he had sold a company to McKesson, and he spun out and formed Castlight Systems. And Castlight's whole business model, I helped him kind of work out his initial pricing model, was that the reason consumers have no access to pricing data is not because the payers are evil, which many people like to believe. It's because the providers lock up the payers in non-disclosure agreements. So the providers can't disclose, or the payers can't disclose. Well, if you can find a self-insured provider, a self-insured employer, which is now the majority of large employers, they own their own data. They're not subject to that NDA. So all you need to do is get a relationship, and their first customer is Safeway, and then send a bot out to the payer, grab all the data, and now you can publish those pricing results not only for Safeway, but for every other company in your area. So that was their business model. They've been struggling because, and there are a lot of other companies now coming at it from different angles, because what's beginning to happen and where the excitement is that the market may be pivoting to more of an auction-like market, where this formalized buy and deliver model of care that we have today is less the game, and it's more of a real-time, open auction, reactive model, right? Not a static one. It's a bit like I was talking to some people at lunch today. When we're coming out of a world where we did market research, and we would do a big survey of 1,000 people, and we would segment them, and then we'd develop solutions for the segments, and then we would run on that path for 3 years, and then we would do another survey. the market is moving away from that. It's now moving to segment sizes of n equals 1 and real-time, always updating data at every interaction point. And so this assess, lag effect that we've lived with forever is going away. It's becoming just a very fluid interaction, and pricing is going to head in that same way, I think.
Thank you, Matthew.
All right.
Tons of great information.